Thank you for allowing me to be here tonight. We're going to be discussing the natural gas outage that happened in the Taos County. But we're also going to be discussing, more importantly, how your law enforcement agencies and how your government responds to that type of emergency event. So we're going to be talking about our plans to respond to a critical incident and how we manage that with the backdrop of the Arctic storm that happened in 2011. I do want to begin this with a personal note to you, which is I don't have enough opportunities to express my appreciation for my career. I understand as a law enforcement officer that I serve you. I also understand as a law enforcement officer that the only reason I'm allowed to do what I do is because you give me that authority. You have given myself and my family a phenomenal career and a wonderful life, and I want to thank you very much once again for my career. So, with much ado, let's get on with the presentation. We'll be talking about the natural gas outage that happened in 2011. You know, there I was on a February morning. I was in municipal court because I'm a traffic officer. Many people don't recognize me when I'm in my clothes. But I normally wear the go-go boots and ride the helmet, or ride the motorcycle. And I was in municipal court, and I had a phone call from a good friend of mine. Her name is Aletha Trujillo. She is the Taos County Emergency Manager. We'll talk a little bit more about Aletha here as we go on. And in this conversation, she told me that New Mexico Gas had notified her that they were going to interrupt service and natural gas to Taos County. I said, okay. I said, well, how much of Taos County? And she said, the entirety of Taos County. I said, well, how long is it going to last? She said, I don't know. I said, when is it going to start? She said, it should have already been cut off. And right there, I heard the furnace in the court go. I was like, okay, well, this is going to be an interesting day. Going to the problem assessment as to what happened. In February, an Arctic storm weather pattern started to come down into northern New Mexico. And it brought with it incredibly low temperatures. The northern two-thirds of the state experienced at least 3 days of below freezing temperatures. The lowest point, which shows a minus 27 degrees, was on February 3rd. So that is what happened with that Arctic storm that came down. Well, the natural gas supplies for northern New Mexico were interrupted. To conserve what natural gas was left inside of the pipelines, New Mexico Natural Gas decided to shut down certain sections of the pipeline. And of course, Taos County, being the northern part of that line, we were shut down. So from that point, from this point, and when we started figuring out what we were going to do, we had just tons of concerns. And the first concern that we have is that as a local law enforcement officer, I cannot order New Mexico Natural Gas to do the recovery the way that I want it to be done. Aletha can't. We don't have that capability. So what we need to do is we needed to work in concert with them. So that's something really kind of important to understand. We didn't have an ability to tell them what to do. We had to be reactive to what their needs were. Well, in the problem assessment, what we figured out was that there was about 28,000 homes that were going to be affected. We knew that of all these homes, all the people and all the animals had to be protected. Now, we learn lessons. We pay attention to what happens in the world around us. And specifically when we talk about animals, I used to be a canine officer, and my dog was Sparky. And Sparky was a Belgian Malinois German Shepherd. He looked like Old Yeller is what he looked like. Well, I had spent every single waking moment and every single sleeping moment, I had spent 24 hours a day with Sparky for the 8 years that I worked him. If you told me that I had to be evacuated and I had to leave Sparky behind, I would tell you that I would not be evacuated. Now, some people who aren't animal lovers don't quite understand that, but that animal truly was an incredible part of my life, and we understood early on that we had to evacuate humans, we had to protect animals. We understood that right off the bat. We also knew that every meter in Taos County had to be touched twice. The first time it had to be touched was that every meter had to be turned off. And then what would happen is they would re-energize the line with natural gas. They would go to the furthest point in the line, open that up, bleed out all of the air, and as soon as they got natural gas, shut that off, and then go in the process of relighting all the homes. So every single meter had to be touched twice. We had no idea how long this was going to last, and we had multiple resources to coordinate, and a number of these resources were already committed to other areas. You understand, during this process, Rio Doso had problems, Albuquerque, Espanola. A number of these different jurisdictions had the same problem that we had, and we started competing for resources. So coming right out of the chute, we knew that this is what we had to contend with. So that was the problem that was just some of the problems that we had to deal with. So how does your government respond to an emergency when we don't know what the emergency is going to be? And that's exactly where we're at. I mean, I should have thought about the probability of New Mexico natural gas being shut off. I really should have thought about that, but I never really did. Other people did. So, how do you develop that response? We try to develop what's called all hazards plans or all hazard responses. And so what we need our response to be easily understood at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. We need to have practiced the plan, and it needs to cover as many emergencies as what we can conceive of. And even then we have to have it cover emergencies that we never thought about. So in New Mexico and for your local agencies, for the Arctic storm, we actually relied on three separate approaches. The first is called critical incident or critical incident management. We'll discuss that here in just a little bit. We went inside the incident command system and used a unified command. So as we go through and we talk about this, this is something that we practice frequently. So first we'll talk about critical incident. So critical incident management is taught to every single law enforcement officer in the state of New Mexico. When they go through their academy, they are taught critical incident management. Now, the way that this course came to be was an armed robbery that happened in Buffalo, New York. And what happened in Buffalo is a subject went inside to do an armed robbery, or they thought he had gone inside to do an armed robbery, but in actuality, he had just taken the people hostage. And then he started to shoot, and he started to shoot out the windows. And as law enforcement officers arrived, the law enforcement officers were being shot. And at the end of it, there was a number of cops that were killed and a number that were injured. And so they developed critical incident management. Because what they did is they went around to all the commanders and they said, what are the problems that we experienced during this event, and what are the problems that we experienced during any type of dangerous event? And they came up with a list of 7 critical things that have to be done. So now let's talk a little bit about cops. So we'll talk about cops, and we'll talk about firefighters, and we'll talk about kind of personality types that we have. Law enforcement officers, to use a sports analogy, we are trained in individual sports. So we would, for instance, be trained like golf players or tennis players. And what I mean by that is that when you have a law enforcement officers normally work by themselves, so one person in the patrol car. And when they show up on a critical incident, it's normally a law enforcement officer. And for right or for wrong, when they're in the academy and when they go through the field training program, we teach them that you are solely responsible for resolving an incident. You are the one, because we don't know where your backup is, we don't know where other people will be. So we entrust them with the idea that they are to solve the issue by themselves. Does that kind of make sense? 9 times out of 10, that's the way it works. 9 times out of 10, If there's a barking dog call, you send one officer and the officer deals with the dog or whatever the issue may be. Now, firefighters are trained in a team event. If you ask for a fire truck, you'll end up with 4 firefighters normally. And they will get out, they will do a scene analysis, they will figure out what the problem is, they will come to a consensus of how they're going to deal with the problem, and then as a team, they go forward. Okay? Now, the problem is that we have to integrate law enforcement and firefighters into resolving issues. And so when we're teaching this course to law enforcement officers, we have to really impress upon them that in a critical instant, they don't have the capability of solving it by themselves. And so we start teaching them team approaches. Okay? Well, a lot of the problems that we have up here, the 7 critical tasks, you will see us using this on a number of events. If you're ever driving through Taos and all of a sudden you see a cop and the road is blocked off and you don't see anything behind the cop, you just see a cop blocking a road, that officer is actually doing something. We'll talk about what they're doing. Well, we know in every critical event, we know that communications is always a problem. It just is a problem. And during the Arctic storm, one of the few times in which I was actually able to pretend like I knew something, we were inside the Emergency Operations Center for the town of Taos, and the mayor and the city council people, they were on their cell phones and they were talking, and I stopped all of them mid-sentence and I said, your cell phones will go down pretty shortly, just so you know. And sure enough, their cells stopped working. Well, we know in crisis events, we know that people reach out to touch other people. And we know that the cell towers will be overrun quickly. And that's what happened. So, I said, your cell phone's going to die. And then right then the mayor's cell phone died, and he looked at me. It's like, oh, how'd you know that? Oh. Can I tell you, I know these things. So, for a critical incident, what do? Well, we already talked about communications, identifying the hot zone, and the hot zone really is the problem area. Where is the big issue? What is the location where the people or property or animals are going to be endangered? So if this is hazardous material, where is the hazardous material being released? If this is a person with a weapon, what's the range of that weapon? If this is a pretty severe collision in which we're going to need to get a number of resources inside of it, what is the target zone of it? If it's a fire, how big is the fire? So that's the hot zone. Inner perimeter, outer perimeter, staging areas, command post, etc. To show you what this looks like, this is a map of the town of Taos, and this is Paseo Pueblo Sur driving through there. If we had a problem where that arrow is, we would identify that as the hot zone. And so the next thing that we would do is we'd come through and set up an inner perimeter. Now, the inner perimeter is designed to contain that event. And so people are not allowed to have uncontrolled access in or uncontrolled access or to exit it. If you remember the Columbine shooting, when the children were coming out of the store and they were being searched, that was the inner perimeter. They didn't allow anyone to go out until they had searched it because they didn't want the suspect to come out. If this is hazardous material, we don't want people to come out uncontrolled and contaminate other people or get sick at their home. So that's the inner perimeter. It's tightly controlled. The next thing that we move into is the outer perimeter. And from the outer perimeter point, what we're doing is we're just starting to move traffic. Now, you've seen this, especially in Taos, you've seen this all the time. And I know it's irritating, and I'm sorry. But if we have a commercial motor vehicle that's involved in a collision, I will make the assumption that it's a hazardous material until it's proven otherwise. And so we'll set this up very quickly and then try to identify the material. It turns out not to be hazardous material. It turns out that it wasn't released. Then we'll lift the points up kind of quickly. Okay? So now the other thing that we have is we also create a buffer. And so inside the buffer, the little green area, that's where we're going to stage all the resources that we need. So this is, once again, if this is a hazardous material, that's where we'll stage the firefighters and the hazardous material trucks and everything else. Okay? So this is critical incident management. This is designed for the first hour of a problem. Just the first hour. And then after that, we start moving into scene management. Now, for the fiestas, when we have the fiestas, we go on to critical incident management. We know what the event is. We know historically what issues and what problems that we've had, but I don't know what other problems that we're going to have. So we pre-planned that. This last year, we worked really hard on positioning police officers into parking lots and making sure we didn't have auto burglaries, etc. And then as time goes on, the cops got bored, and pretty soon I had like 20 gazillion cops inside the plaza. And so I had to get them back together and say, why are you guys doing here? They're like, well, there's no problem out there. Okay, but we're still practicing, we're still training, so Gitcher took us back out in the parking lot, and they were like, you're no fun. I am no fun, but get out there, okay? So next year, you should see less cops getting donuts in the plaza. Being the first speaker on this whole series, I was a little bit concerned because I was like, man, I was talking to my wife. I said, if I bomb, I've just killed UNM SMU. So I thought about bringing donuts. I didn't know how many of y'all were going to be here, so I failed on that. But donuts, it's genetics. I don't fight it. We just kind of go with it. So that's critical incident management, and that's the very first thing that we deal with. Now, it doesn't matter what the topic is. Now, I told you that we teach this to all law enforcement officers in the state of New Mexico. We also teach this to the correctional officers. We teach it to an electric company. I've taught it to a gas company. We will teach this course to any person who wants to have the course. Now, it's based on the law enforcement response, but in actuality, we're just talking about if you have a problem, how do you contain the problem? How do you organize your resources? How do you get them into the scene safely and effectively? And how do you deal with it? Okay? So that's critical incident management. Now, this is normally good for about an hour, and then we move into what's called the incident command system. Now, the incident command system was created by a bunch of firefighters. It was developed by wildland firefighters, and it actually started off due to a couple fatalities that they had in a particular fire, and then it grew into a bigger system. The incident command system is an all-hazard system, so basically what happens is after the critical incident, then we move into scene management. Okay? In the incident command system, we have common terms, common titles, communication methodologies. Now, communication is real important because communication is almost always the thing that breaks down right off the bat. I started my career in Doña Ana County, which is Las Cruces, and in Doña Ana County, if an officer were to call a 10 code, if they were to say 1018, a 1018 meant that officer's life was in immediate jeopardy, and we needed to get as many cops as we could to that person. In my entirety in Doña Ana County, I think I've heard 1018 maybe for 15 years being down there. I think I heard it 7 times. So it's a very, very important call. If you hear 1018, it's time to get going. Well, I moved up to Taos to be next to my parents and to be a son, and I was walking through the patrol officers here at the Taos Police Department in our little patrol room, and an officer calls 1018 on Kid Carson of Birch. Well, I went screaming out the door, and I ran past a whole bunch of cops, and I kind of wondered how come they weren't running too, but I hopped in the car, and I did lights and sirens, and I almost ran over a carload of nuns, and I got down to Kit Carson of Birch, and there's the officer, and I came out with my shotgun, and he is staring at a cow. Because in northern New Mexico, 1018 means that there's livestock on the roadway. So I said, well, that's good to know. I wish I had known that earlier. I wouldn't have done this. So when we go into common terminology, we have police officers speak in plain English. Well, that's a problem. Because I'm used to saying, if I'm going to go home, I will tell the dispatcher, I'm 1042. I'm home. When you tell law enforcement officers don't use 10 codes, all of a sudden they think they have to give this huge sentence as to what they're doing. So they'll say, 220 Taos, go ahead. I'm going to drive home now. I'm going to go down to Ranchitos and turn to my house. Oh, look, my dog's out of the yard, but I'm here. And so, once again, this is something that has to be practiced. Now, I love my law enforcement brothers and sisters. I do. There's a couple that not so much love, but most of them I really adore. I really do. But we just teach them so often to be very, very brief on the radio and use 10 codes that when you give them carte blanche to speak, it's all of those years bottled up. And so every once in a while, I had a dear friend of mine, and we were in a crisis event, and he was talking and talking and talking and talking and talking. So I went and found him and snagged his radio and took his antenna off, and I threw his antenna, and I took the battery, and I threw the battery, and I handed the radio back to him, and I said, please don't put that back together again. Just please don't. So this has to be trained, it has to be practiced, and so we'll talk about how we do that and when we do those things. So now, in Instant Command system, kind of the neat thing about Instant Command is that it grows very quickly and it disassembles very quickly. You have a couple sections in there. You have a planning section, and that's the person that's responsible for actually planning the next events and figuring out how the resources are going to play out. In the Arctic Storm event, the person that we had as the planning director was Dave Wallace. Dave Wallace is the Department of Public Safety Director for Taos Ski Valley. If you don't know Dave, you need to go meet him. He's truly one of the nicest men in the world. And he is also a Bee Gees fan. So during the Emergency Operations Center that was open for about 5 days, we kept hearing the Bee Gees off in the background. Well, Dave is also a very, very big, strong man, so I didn't want to turn off his radio because I was afraid he would squeeze me and throw me. But Dave Wallace, we have used a number of times as a planning director. Very intelligent, probably one of the calmest people I've ever known in my life, and he's absolutely the perfect person to have in that position. The next group that we had was logistics and finance. Now, logistics are the people that find the resources that you need, and the finance are the people that keep the bills up and they pay for it eventually. Then you have the operations section. The operations section is where every cop and every firefighter wants to be, because the operations are the people that actually solve the problem. Those are the people that deal with that. Now, underneath operations is where you bring in your specialists. So, for instance, a gentleman was talking to me earlier, talking about if the electric grid goes out, do we know how to re-energize the electric grid and how to do that? I don't. But I would bring in a specialist who did know how to do that. And so that's how that kind of grows. Make sense? Now, when I got married, I went inside the Instant Command system. My to-be wife was the Incident Commander. What she says, goes. I was operations. I was the guy that made things happen. My daughter, she was in part of planning, part of logistics. My wife oversaw the finance. And then we also had a threat assessment branch set off in case my ex-wife showed up. So in the intel branch, I had a couple really big cops, and here's the photograph of my ex-wife, and if she shows up, she needs to leave. And they were like, got it. Well, it got to the point that it was so organized that about 2.5 weeks before the wedding, Val and I went out and talked to the wedding planner, and we're like, okay, what do we have to do now? And she said, you're done. Well, how much money do we owe you? Because according to our records, we still owed about $200. She's like, nope, I was like, really? She said, yeah. I said, well, so what do we do? And she said, just relax for 2 weeks. 2 weeks are probably some of the most uncomfortable 2 weeks I had because I kept thinking that I screwed something up, But the wedding went off, and we're pretty happy. So my daughter's getting ready to have a child, and I keep trying to tell her that we can go into Instant Command, we can organize this whole thing. And for some reason, she thinks that natural childbirth is beyond my capabilities, so we don't get to do that. So when we were inside the Arctic Storm, I'll tell you some of the people that were involved in it. Some people that were inside the Unified Command. Now, a Unified Command is a way that we can bring in all interested parties into the command system. So for the Arctic Storm, we had to deal with Taos County and also the town of Taos and also Taos Pueblo and all these other different jurisdictions. Now, some of the jurisdictions created their own emergency plan. So, for instance, Red River had entered their own emergency operations center. They dealt with themselves, and they didn't interact with us very much, except for me calling them and asking what problems that they had, because they resolved their issue before ours was. So we reached out and we talked to them. Cuesta set up their own emergency operations center. So in the Arctic storm, we had Taos County. We brought in Dave Wallace from Taos Ski Valley, just because of his capabilities. We had New Mexico State Police. We had Town of Taos. We had American Red Cross. We had State Emergency Management was represented in there as well. Now, the incident commander for this is a lady by the name of Aletha Trujillo. And Aletha is the emergency manager for Taos County. So for this event, Aletha was the boss. I was working operations. We also had another individual by the name of Bill Hubbard. And Bill Hubbard, at the time, was with the Taos Police Department. He is now the director of Special Investigation Division, but he was my counterpart in the operations. Bill is most known for his bouffant. He has a beautiful head of hair, just a gorgeous head of hair. It's like every little thing's right in line, and that's the way that he works as well. And so when you're dealing with Bill, he will very much do things very much by the number and be very orchestrated and very organized. I have a tendency to be like a 6-month-old lab puppy. So Bill was a real good person to have with me, because every once in a while he would tell me, you're really getting ahead of yourself, so stop what you're doing. So that was pretty much the unified command that we had going through there. So when we went into this deal, we needed an emergency operations center. And now the reason that you need an emergency operations center is you need an area where decisions can be made, and you need a focal point where people know where to go to. You need a central voice so the media gets the information out or receives one voice from us. And so what we had done in the town of Taos about 6 months before is I had gone to the town of Taos and we'd gone to the convention center, and we had pre-designated the convention center as an emergency operations center. And I was so proud of myself. I thought, this is going to be great. That was wonderful, because we have hardline communications, we have a media center, command staff area, kitchen, restrooms, pretty much everything that you need for an emergency operations center. And I got to tell you, when I was in municipal court and I heard the gas go, I was like, breezy, we'll just go across the street. So we all went across the street, and I was really pretty happy until we realized yeah. So the lady that brought this to my attention is Ms. Abigail Adami. And Ms. Abigail Adami is the assistant town manager at the town of Taos. And I had not dealt with Ms. Adami very much. At the end of this, I have a tremendous amount of respect for her. She is just really a neat woman. And one quality that she has that really irritates me is she doesn't speak often, but when she speaks, she points out the incredibly obvious to me. And she's the one who came walking up and said, "Isn't this natural gas heated?" I was like, "Nice talk. See ya." So the problem then we had was, where do we go? What do we do next? Well, so we got everybody inside the Emergency Operations Center there at the town of Taos. We got the mayor and the city council, and we declared an emergency. And it's very important for us to have declared an emergency. One, that gives the authority to the Unified Command to allow the Unified Command to work. It gave me authority to work on behalf of the town, and also connects us to the state and eventually into funding streams to get reimbursed for a lot of the stuff. So it was very important to do that. So he declared an emergency. In the meantime, Aletha ran off and she went to Kit Carson, and she was able to score an emergency operations center from Kit Carson. Well, it's heated by electricity. Good. Computers. And they came in. Kit Carson Electric really went out of its way. It really did. They set up computer banks, and their IT folks came through, and we had conference room and restrooms and a kitchen. They just really went out of their way. So I was like, well, that's great. So we sit inside the Emergency Operations Center, and we're starting to feel good about this. And we're like, okay, we're starting to go down the path. And then the electricity went. And And I just sat there and I stared at Aletha and I was like, what did we do to deserve this? Why are we... And then the lights came back on. We're like, okay, good. Well, what happened was Kit Carson had, they started getting a real big influx of power usage throughout the county, so they had to start moving power from different grids to different grids. And so they'd come walking in, they'd say, hey, in about 20 minutes, it's going to gray out, and then it'll be back up. You don't have to worry about it. We're like, okay, good. So they did that about 3 times. And then people from the employees that deal with the wells and the waterworks, they came walking in and they said, can we talk to you for a second? I'm like, yeah, we'll talk to you a second. They said, did you know the power was going to get shut down? I was like, well, yeah. They said, how come you didn't tell me? I said, do I need to tell you? They said, well, yeah, because every time that happens, it shuts down the well. So we have to go and we have to redo the well. I was like, is that a big deal? They said, yeah, it's a big deal. I said, okay, I'm sorry. And I said, well, it's going to go out again. They said, when? I said, right about now. And went out again. It's like, I told you. They didn't think that was funny. I thought it was hysterical. So that's what we had going. So that is probably about the first 4 hours of this event. So the next thing that we did was we entered into operational periods. And an operational period is how long you're going to stay working. If it's a 8-hour operational period, that means the command staff works for 8 hours, and the next command staff comes in 8 hours, or 8-hour operational period. One of the problems that we had, and that we got critiqued on pretty hard, and it was real valid, was that we had not trained up enough people to be in command positions. And so that command staff that we talked about, we ended up doing about 24 hours a day for the 5 days. Not smart. Just really isn't. Day number 3, my sense of humor was gone. And I would get 4 hours sleep here and 5 hours sleep there, but it was just not a good setup. So that's one of the problems that we had. So our operational period was just huge. But we had our first operational meeting, and that's in the afternoon of the 3rd. It took a while to get everybody there because we as a community had not trained putting together an emergency operations center. We had spoken about it, but we had never actually called people and said, meet at the emergency operations center now. And so different players that we needed were trying to solve their issues from their location, and we had to drag them over to the emergency operations center. When we finally got them there, when you go inside the first operational briefing, for the first operational briefing, there was a couple members of the media that were there, and I kicked them out. Did not go over well with my boss. The mayor, and kind of a couple, two caveats. The first caveat is that New Mexico Gas really was up to their ears in alligators and really trying hard. They were really working hard. You're not going to hear me bash on them. I mean, they have taken their lickings. They've held themselves accountable. They have solved issues that they could. The second group of people were the elected officials. And the problem with this event is this went on so long and we didn't have the answers for them. It's very frustrating for them because the mayor is really strongly believes in open government and being very transparent to the highest degree that he could. And we just didn't have the information to give him. And we'll talk about why we didn't have that. So, but I needed to kick the media out of here because the first meeting was actually pretty chaotic. Because we had probably 40 or 50 people in there, and it was all over the place. And so finally I had to shut everyone down, and a couple of people didn't, so I had to growl at them. And that first meeting from an outside source would look like we were really out of control. Now, the other thing that was happening in the meeting is there were a number of people that were talking about how Big Brother had set up Taos County, and were really negative conversations about the utilities and negative conversations about this whole event. And we really needed to shut that down because it doesn't matter why we're there, we have to go forward. And so I needed everyone to be positive going forward. And so, the message that I sent out to everybody was, we're in a problem. The problem will be resolved. Everything will be okay. We have to work really hard to protect people. It's time for us to be positive and look forward. And so that's what we did. So it's kind of a long meeting because everyone was allowed to discuss the particular issues and particular concerns that they had. And then once everyone was done, Mr. Heel came up with marching orders of the things that we needed to do. And this was just a real, this is like the first day of what we had to do. The first thing was we had to figure out an evacuation center for the humans, an evacuation center for the animals. We needed to protect the infrastructure away from water damage, etc. We needed to protect against mass panic, and we needed to assist New Mexico Gas with their process. And so those were the real quick marching orders that we came up with. And so what we did was we canceled all the law enforcement days off. The orders to the law enforcement officers were that they were to show real high presence. And the first place that I sent them to, quite honestly, was the New Mexico Gas Company offices. I needed a law enforcement presence there in case people really started getting angry, because the local techs, the local New Mexico Gas technicians, really are some of the heroes of this event, because they went above and beyond. And we wanted to make sure that they were in a safe environment, that if they came back to the office and they needed like 30 minutes to sleep or an hour to sleep, we wanted to make sure that was a safe place for them to be. We sent our officers to Walmart and Ace Hardware and other places because we knew there would be a rush on electric wall heaters, etc. And sure enough, that did happen, but it wasn't out of control. We also wanted them to the hospital, pharmacies, areas of critical vulnerability. And so that's what we sent out. And then the big thing right there, which was to find the real-time intelligence, because I needed to know where exactly New Mexico Gas was at in their process of relighting. And that turned out to be an issue. And we'll discuss that here in a little bit. But that was the first kind of marching orders that that Mr. Heel sent out there. So, we started working on evacuating humans, and I really thought that there would be a whole lot of people that would be evacuated. And so the town of Taos came up, and they I'm sorry, I forgot about the slide. So, talking about the evacuation process, we need to figure out where we were going to put humans, where we were going to put animals, how you were going to do that, food for the evacuation sites, and then continuity of food services. And continuity of food services, think of it this way. There are some children that go to school and have a school lunch, a school breakfast and school lunch, and that is their meal. And so over the weekends, many times they'll pack lunch bags for them. Well, the schools are shut down. And so Ms. Trujillo brought this up. I was like, wow, I never even thought about that. So we had organized continuity of food services to children, also to the elderly. So the town of Taos came out, and we had a number of buses. I didn't know how many people were going to be evacuated. In my mind, I was really thinking worst case scenario that we would have hundreds upon hundreds. So town of Taos organized a whole bunch of buses. Taos County organized a place for large animals and small animals. Kit Carson Electric opened up the regional command center. The American Red Cross went to the command center, inspected it to see if it was appropriate. They finally gave their blessings on it. And so we had an evacuation place for the animals, had an evacuation place for the humans. American Red Cross, which has always been one of my most favorite organizations in the world, started working on the food. They got with the Taos school districts, a couple other school districts, started creating a lot of food. I'm thinking, man, we got this. We're good. Let's start evacuating people. And so we're all geared up to go, and one guy showed up. And he got bored after a while, and he split. So on one hand, I was very proud of us that we really got that thing up and going quickly. I thought, wow, that's kind of groovy. And this really caught me off guard. And actually it turned out to be that a a lot of the cops that live in the city actually end up sleeping there, and seemed like the cops were very, very well fed. They gained a couple pounds during this event. So, and that kind of caused, and at this point in time, when we didn't have a whole lot of people showing up, that actually caused me a lot of concern. I was like, where are these people at? And hindsight, I mean, after the event, what we found were people started hooking up with neighbors and family and getting out of town, which made my life a lot easier. But at this point in time, I really started worrying about what we call a fatality management plan. A fatality management plan means that at the end of it, we go to see how many people are dead. Well, in this whole event, the people that really were the heroes, actually the fire department, and specifically Taos Volunteer Fire Department. These men and women were incredible. They went through, they talked to Ruidoso, and they said, hey, what problems did you have? And they said, well, what we had a problem with in these large commercial buildings with the fire suppression units, those froze, and they started bursting and flooding the entirety of the building. So Taos Valley, the fire department went through and drained all the large buildings of the water suppression stuff. They went around with the gas company and shut down all the gas lines. They also responded to a bunch of fires, Kiva fireplaces. Now, the emergency call to response. We kept getting emails. I get emails from people. And one lady sent me an email, and she said she was really concerned about her mother and father, who were 80 and 85, respectively. And she was really concerned about them. So what happened was the fire department, we actually created a response group. So they went out to the home and found that Grandma and Grandpa were fine. Just not a problem. They're okay. So they came back. Well, about 4 hours later, I get another email from a lady. So I sent them back out to the house. And they gave me a call, and they said, they're fine. They're fine. I said, do they need anything? No. Then about 4 hours later, I got another email, so I sent the firefighters again. Well, this time, Grandma and Grandpa were not too thrilled to see the firefighters. They offered them a cup of coffee, and they told them to leave. And so they left, and we didn't see from them again. They also went through and turned the gas back on, and they did the fatality management plan. So now, going ahead, pretty soon the state got themselves involved, and Governor Martinez went through and initiated the State Emergency Operations Center. They started coordinating with New Mexico Gas. Albuquerque started sending out APD officers to smaller areas. At this point in time, the pressure started kind of getting relieved from us, but by about, I don't know, day number 3, we started having issues because I didn't know where the crews were. Our plan was for New Mexico Gas to start at the northern part of the town and work south, and then we could time them. And then if someone lived down in this area, I'd be able to forecast when the gas company would be there. But the gas company actually segmented the town. And so we didn't really know where they were at any particular time. So I sent officers out there saying, find the crews. Well, you got to remember, the crew would drive down the road and then drive into the backyard of the house, turn the gas back on, come back out. So if they didn't catch them in that little time frame, we didn't know where they were. So that turned out to be a pretty big issue. After a while, we became convinced that the New Mexico Gas response was faltering. Well, if you look at what they had to do and how many areas they had to deal with, and their crews were working 24 hours a day as well, they were slowing down, and we didn't know where they were at. So we really kind of thought they were faltering. So it was about 2 o'clock in the morning on day number 3, going day number 4, and we're sitting around, and one of us said, why don't you tell people to turn the gas on if they can? And we went, huh. So we sent out a message, and the message said, if you believe that you can safely turn the gas meter on, which is taking a wrench and slowly turning it on, and then if you think you can safely light your pilot lights, please do. We're like, you're going to self-rescue. Have at it, okay? Well, I wasn't here for the phone call, so I'm going to have to go off of hearsay, but they had a phone call, the Unified Command got a phone call from some attorneys, and the attorneys said, you are violating federal law. You cannot tell people to do that, and we are going to prosecute you. Well, around the table, combined, was probably about 150 years of law enforcement experience. I believe one comment was, where are you going to find a jury? And then another comment was, who are you going to send to arrest us? The pipeline police? And then I'm told that a dear friend of mine by the name of Aletha Trujillo kind of let them know exactly what she thought. And I'm told that it was a very colorful conversation, and at the end of it, I'm told that the attorneys were saying, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am. Now, it is common in an emergency situation for the command staff to develop its own name for the incident. And that's when this became Gastastrophe. So you notice you have the pipeline police. Have you ever seen me wearing the jacket, pipeline police? That's where this is coming from. And Gastastrophe. Now, I thought this was just absolutely hysterical. Governor Martinez did not. So Governor Martinez put out an order, and she said, all press releases will be released through the governor's office. This is not up for discussion. And we said, okay. New Mexico National Guard arrived, and they started their work, and then Taos County was told kind of informally that we would play nice. We said, okay. So we stopped kind of growling. So when New Mexico National Guard came up, what they did was they went around with the gas company, and they went through and tagged all the buildings. Where someone wasn't home, when turned the gas on, they'd tag it and then walk away. And the tag said, when you come home, call this phone number, and then we'll relight you. And then someone said, but if you're a burglar, you now know where someone's not home. And they said, ah. So they went back and took all those things off again. Then we started the relighting process. And in the relighting process, our priority was we did large buildings first, like the TCA was lit first. We did houses of worship, and we did restaurants. And the idea was if it completely failed, we at least had warm places where people could go, and we had food. So some people kind of criticized us for that, but we're like, listen, we're trying to, if it really stops, the TCA is warm. So that's what we did. And the next thing we did was that we moved in to the fatality management. And the fatality management plan, we went back to the Taos Volunteer Fire Department and said, okay, well, here's the deal. You need to go to every home that has not been touched, and you need to make sure there's not someone dead inside of it. Well, the fire department didn't know about that. They thought they were done. I was like, no, we have to do this. And they were tired, and they let me know exactly what they thought about my fatality management plan. I was like, I understand, I'm sorry. Went back through, and then they touched every building. So once again, the fire department was just outstanding. They really did a great job. Now, this has been very much a Reader's Digest about the whole event. At the end of it, we actually started working with FEMA, started submitting all the bills. That was a huge process. The town of Taos expended in the area about $90,000. FEMA reimbursed us about $60,000. The rest came from the state. Went through and did our final briefing to the elected officials. They went to Santa Fe for all the hearings. After action report was generated, dispersed all the way throughout the whole for the Taos County. Now, some of the things that the after action report came back, and they said, listen, you need to train up people so that they can take those command positions, and I agree. So for fiestas and everything, we're starting to do that process. They said you need to train more people in the incident command system, which we started doing as well. So, we've learned from this, and we keep working it. And so pretty much, that was very much the Reader's Digest of the whole event, of how the whole thing worked out. Okay? And I guess I've pretty much used up my allotted time, haven't I? Because I can give you a 5-second answer in 2 minutes. Check, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Well, if you want to continue a little bit more, but...
Well, I mean, there is one big thing that happened.
Continue, please.
I'll let you know. So, once again, in the Unified Command, I was the Operations Sector Chief, and there was a lady by the name of Valerie Mondragon who was the finance and logistics person. And during that time frame, I was able to impress her so much that she married me. Yeah. So I give the credit, she gives the blame for New Mexico natural gas as to how that happened.